The cab's radio buzzed with annoying interference, as if someone were scratching the bottom of a pan with a rusty fork. The static swallowed up the faint sound of a local news station, spitting out fragments about recent shootings on Detroit's east side. It was 11 o'clock on a damp, cold March night, and the rain was coming down in furious gusts, pounding on the roof of the 2003 Ford Crown Victoria as if it wanted to punch it to the ground. The fogged-up windshield barely allowed Raymond Carver to see the deserted streets ahead, forcing him to rub the glass with the sleeve of his threadbare jacket. The acrid smell of cold coffee mixed with the rancidity of cheap cigarettes hung heavy in the air, impregnated in his clothes, on his skin, in every corner of that car that was both his livelihood and his prison. He was 37, but he looked older, his shoulders bowed by exhaustion, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the last thread holding him to sanity. Raymond blinked hard, trying to shake off the sleep that weighed like lead on his eyelids. He had earned a measly $22 in 7 hours of work, and the gauge on the gas tank was already trembling dangerously close to empty. At home, on the kitchen table, a stack of sealed envelopes screamed for attention. Overdue utility bills, eviction notices from the bank, reminders that the mortgage on the house in Hamtramck was 3 months overdue. The phone didn't stop ringing during the day, always the same number, collectors with cold, impatient voices demanding what he didn't have to give. He needed a passenger, anyone, or he would return to Linda empty-handed once again, facing her gaze that mixed love, pity, and a silent despair that killed him inside. Suddenly a scream ripped through the air, cutting through the monotony of rain and static like a sharp knife. It was no ordinary scream, the kind you hear in bar fights or street arguments. It was something primal, charged with pure terror, a sound that seemed to be torn from the bowels of someone on the verge of collapse. Raymond slammed on the brakes so hard that the cab skidded, the tires singing against the wet asphalt, his heart racing as if it were trying to escape his chest. He turned his head to the right, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the faint glow of the headlights. There, in a narrow alleyway between two abandoned buildings, he saw what he didn't want to see: a woman, soaked to the bone, holding 2 small children against her trembling body. Her hair was stuck to her face, dripping with dirty water, and her wide eyes shone with a fear that seemed alive, pulsating in the freezing air. The boy, about 5 years old, was crying loudly, a hoarse cry that echoed off the cracked concrete walls, his nose running as he clung to his mother's leg. The little girl, less than a year old, was curled up in her arms, her pale, wet face pressed against the woman's chest, too quiet for such a chaotic night. Raymond lowered the window with a sudden movement, the biting wind throwing raindrops in his face. "Get in, quick!" he shouted, his hoarse voice coming out louder than he had intended. The woman froze for a moment, her eyes fixed on him as if trying to decide whether he was salvation or a threat, but the children's cries pushed her forward. She stumbled as she ran, almost falling, before opening the back door and throwing herself into the seat with her children clinging to her. The interior of the cab immediately became heavy, with the sound of gasping breaths and muffled sobs. The woman was shaking so much that Raymond could hear her teeth chattering, a rhythmic, desperate sound that seemed to synchronize with the accelerated beating of his own heart. The children snuggled even closer against her, the boy rubbing his red eyes while the girl maintained her frightened silence, her little fingers clutching her mother's torn coat. Raymond adjusted the rear-view mirror, trying to get a better look at her face. She was young, maybe 30, but the weight of poverty made her look a decade older, her skin pale, her lips cracked, the dark circles like bruises under her eyes. "Where to?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, trying to bring some order to the chaos that had just invaded his car. She didn't answer straight away. She only sobbed louder, the sound choked and wet as she hugged the children, as if she feared someone would snatch them away from her at any moment. Raymond felt a shiver run up his spine. It wasn't just the rain or the cold. There was something wrong, something beyond what he could see. He knew those streets, that neighborhood. The East Side didn't forgive the weak, and that alley was one of the worst places to be at night. Drug dealers prowled the corners, prostitutes disappeared without a trace, and the cries that echoed there rarely found help. "Hey, talk to me," he insisted, his tone hardening. "What's going on? Where do you need to go?" "Please," she finally managed to say, her voice so weak that it barely carried across the space between them. "I don't know. Just get me out of here." The words came out choppy, laden with a desperation that made Raymond's stomach churn. He opened his mouth to ask more, but then he saw the blood, a thin cut on her forehead, half hidden by her wet hair, dripping in a red thread down the boy's jacket. It wasn't deep, but it was fresh, and the sight of it hit him like a punch. Someone had done this to her. Someone had hurt her, abandoned her there with those children, and now she was in his hands, a bankrupt taxi driver who could barely look after himself. Raymond turned the wheel hard, the tires singing again as he sped away from the alley. The rain beat down on the glass as if trying to invade the car, and the radio continued to spit out static, now mixed with a distant voice talking about a body found in the Detroit River. He turned it off with a slap, the silence falling like a thick curtain. In the rearview mirror, the woman rocked the child in her arms, whispering something Raymond couldn't understand, while the girl remained motionless, her eyes closed, as if she had given up fighting the nightmare around her. He drove aimlessly for a few minutes, his heart still racing, his thoughts spinning in a whirlpool of anger and impotence. Who would do this to a mother? Who would leave two children in such a situation? He knew the type. Cowardly men who hit and ran, who abandoned entire families to rot on the streets. He had seen it before, in the faces of the passengers he picked up at night, in the stories he heard between stops, but seeing it up close, feeling the weight of that despair inside his own car, was different. It was personal. "You're hurt," he said, more a statement than a question, his eyes returning to the rearview mirror. She touched her forehead with trembling fingers, as if only now noticing the blood. "It's nothing," she murmured, but her voice faltered, betraying the fear that still gripped her. "I just need to go home. Warren, 1427 Maple Street." Her voice was a thread of hope, almost faded, but enough to give Raymond a direction. He adjusted course, the cab cutting through the night as the rain thickened, turning the streets into shallow rivers. The meter began to run. $3, $5, $7, but each click seemed to mock him. He needed that money. He needed it so badly that he could almost feel the weight of the bills in his hands. But there, with that woman bleeding and those children crying, he knew he wasn't going to charge it. He couldn't. It was as if a part of him, buried under years of defeat and regret, had suddenly woken up, screaming at him to do the right thing, even if it sank him even lower. "Hold on tight," he said, not knowing whether he was talking to her or to himself. The cab's engine coughed, as if protesting against the decision he hadn't yet verbalized. Raymond gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his gaze fixed on the road, but his mind lost in a sea of doubt. He was throwing away his only chance of saving his own skin for a stranger he would never see again. And yet, as the cab sped through the relentless night, he felt he had no choice. The cab cut through the dark streets of Detroit like a limping beast, the engine groaning with each acceleration as the rain continued to batter the hood. Raymond Carver kept his eyes fixed on the fogged glass, but his mind was elsewhere, a place where the city lights couldn't reach, where the weight of a lifetime of wrong choices and broken dreams pulled him under like a current in deep water. He was no hero. That much he knew. He wasn't the kind of man who appeared in the newspapers or who anyone remembered after crossing his path. At 37, Raymond was just another tired face on the streets, an ordinary taxi driver who carried passengers and their problems from one corner of a city that seemed to hate its own children. He was big, almost clumsy, with broad shoulders that had once carried heavy boxes on the Chrysler assembly line before the 2008 crisis ended it all. His grey goatee hid a scar on his chin, a gift from a stupid night 20 years ago when he thought he could take on a guy with a broken bottle in a bar on Woodward Avenue. His hands, calloused and scarred from old cuts, gripped the steering wheel with a strength that betrayed the tension he was trying to hide. His brown hair, sparse and unkempt, fell over his sweaty forehead, and his brown eyes, deep-set from exhaustion, carried a stubborn glint that was the last remnant of who he had once been. A man with plans, with hope, with a future that seemed possible. Now, all that was in the past. Raymond and Linda, his wife of 19 years, lived in a dilapidated house in Hamtramck, a working-class neighborhood where the smell of burning oil and freshly baked bread mixed in the air. The house had been a gift from her parents, but today it was more of a burden. The roof leaked, the paint peeled like dead skin, and the heater only worked when it wanted to. Beautiful, slim, and kind-eyed, she still worked part-time at the corner market, packing groceries for a wage that barely paid the electricity bill. They had no children, not by choice, but because of a cruel sequence of losses. 2 miscarriages in the early years of their marriage had left scars that neither of them spoke about out loud. After the second, Linda stopped trying, and Raymond stopped asking. The silence between them grew like a third presence in the house, an unwelcome guest who never left. The cab was all that was left. A 2003 Ford Crown Victoria, bought second-hand from a retired chauffeur for a pittance that had nevertheless eaten into his savings. He had been driving it for 7 years, ever since the factory closed its doors and left him without a floor. 20 years on the streets of Detroit had hardened him, but not enough to erase what was left of his humanity. He'd seen it all. Cold-eyed drug dealers delivering packages on dark street corners, prostitutes shivering in the cold as they waited for clients who never paid what they'd promised, entire families huddled in cardboard boxes under overpasses, the empty eyes of those who'd given up fighting. Raymond took them all, charged what he could, and moved on. But that night, something inside him was different, a crack in his armor that he didn't even know still existed. As he drove through the rain, the sound of the tires against the wet asphalt was accompanied by the muffled crying of the little boy in the back seat. The woman, he still didn't know her name, held the children with a strength that seemed to defy her own frail body. The boy, his nose running and his face red from screaming, was rubbing his eyes with his dirty hands, his thin, soaked coat sticking to his skin. The little girl, smaller and frighteningly quiet, was curled up on her mother's lap, her brown hair sticking to her pale face, her eyes closed, as if she had locked herself in a world where pain couldn't reach her. Raymond looked in the rearview mirror, trying to decipher the scene. She was young, maybe 30, but the weight she was carrying made her look older. Her face swollen from crying, her lips trembling, the cut on her forehead dripping with blood that she didn't even seem to notice. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he had intended. She shook her head, the sobs choking in her throat, and hugged the children even tighter. "Please, just take me home," she whispered, almost inaudibly, her eyes fixed on the floor of the cab, as if she were afraid to face the world outside. "I don't have any money. I have nothing." The words fell like stones on Raymond's chest, each syllable a blow he didn't want to feel. He needed that money. He needed it like he needed air to breathe. The $18 for the ride to Warren was the difference between paying for the gas heater or sleeping in the cold again, between calming Linda down for one more night or watching her despair grow like a storm he couldn't stop. He gripped the steering wheel until his fingers ached, his knuckles white as exposed bones. The rain beat down on the roof like a war drum, and the meter buzzed beside him, marking every penny he was throwing away. "Okay," he finally said, the words scratching his throat as if they were made of broken glass. "Tell me the address." She mumbled the number, 1427 Maple Street, Warren, between sobs, her voice so weak that he had to concentrate to hear it. It was a modest neighborhood, about 20 minutes away, far enough from the east side to be safe, but close enough that the smell of danger still hung in the air. Raymond turned on the heater with a jerky movement, the engine coughing in protest as the warm air began to circulate, mixed with the damp smell of wet clothes and fear. He stepped on the accelerator, the cab picking up speed through the flooded streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. As he drove, thoughts came in waves, each one heavier than the last. "I'm an idiot. I can't afford to do charity. The bank will take the house, and I'll leave Linda on the street because of it." He imagined her face, the gentle eyes that still looked at him with love despite everything, and felt a lump in his throat. What if it was Linda there, in the back seat, shivering with cold and fear? What if it were the children they never had, crying for help that nobody gave? He had no answers. He never had. Life had thrown him around like a punching bag, and he had learned to take the blows without complaining. But now, with that woman and those children depending on him, something stirred inside him, a spark of something he thought he had lost. He looked through the rearview mirror again, seeing the boy gradually calm down, the sobs giving way to tired sniffles, while the girl remained motionless, a silent weight in her mother's arms. The woman, or rather the mother, had stopped crying, but her shoulders were still shaking, as if her body didn't know how to stop suffering. Detroit passed by outside like a blur of concrete and neon, the streetlights reflecting in the puddles like drowned stars. Hamtramck lagged behind, with its abandoned factories and crooked houses, while Warren drew closer, with its cleaner streets and its promises of a less cruel life. Raymond knew every corner of that town, every pothole in the road, every dangerous corner, every story the streets told in silence. He had been born there, grown up there, and would probably die there like so many others. But that night, driving in the rain with 3 strangers in the back seat, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he could still change something, if only for them. "You'll be fine," he said, more to himself than to her, his voice low but firm. She didn't reply, but raised her eyes for a moment, meeting his in the rearview mirror. There was gratitude there, mixed with a fear that wouldn't go away so easily. Raymond looked away, focused on the road, and let the silence fall again. The cab purred, the rain hammered, and the meter kept counting, $10, $12, $15. He knew he wasn't going to get that money. He knew it, and he hated knowing it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing something worthwhile, even if it hurt like hell. The cab sped through the sodden streets of Detroit, the roar of the engine almost drowned out by the incessant drumming of the rain against the roof. The heater hummed, sending warm, humid air into the car, but it wasn't enough to dry the soaked clothes of the woman and children in the back seat. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, interrupted only by the intermittent crying of the boy, which had now subsided into exhausted sobs, and the shaky breathing of the mother, who held her children as if they were the only anchor in a sea of despair. Raymond kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was a battlefield, every thought an explosion of doubt, anger, and a guilt he couldn't name. The meter kept spinning, relentlessly, $16, $17, $18. Each click was a reminder of what he was losing, of the financial hole he was sinking further into by deciding not to charge for the ride. He imagined Linda at home, awake, waiting for him with that look that mixed hope and resignation. She didn't deserve this. Another night of empty promises, another day of bills they couldn't pay. Raymond felt his stomach churn, a mixture of nausea and panic rising in his throat. He needed that money. He needed it like a man in the desert needs water. But there, with that woman bleeding and those children trembling, he knew he couldn't ask for anything. He couldn't be that kind of man. The address in Warren, 1427 Maple Street, was only a few minutes away now, and Raymond accelerated, the tires throwing dirty water against the deserted sidewalks. He wanted to get it over with, get his wife and kids to safety and get back to his own fight. But something in her voice, in that faint whisper of, "I have nothing," kept echoing in his head like a badly tuned radio that he couldn't turn off. He looked in the rearview mirror again. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but the dried blood formed a dark crust that further highlighted the pallor of her face. The boy sniffled, his eyes swollen from crying, while the girl remained quiet, almost invisible, curled up on her mother's lap like a broken doll. When the cab finally stopped in front of the house, a modest red brick building with a crooked porch and a single light on in the window, Raymond turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. The rain continued to fall, but now it was a distant sound, as if the world outside had stopped to watch what was happening inside that car. The woman hesitated, her trembling fingers gripping the door handle. "Thank you," she said, her voice so low that it was almost lost in the noise of the rain. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, as if she were ashamed to be alive. Raymond nodded, saying nothing, and watched her get out of the cab with the children in her arms, stumbling on the wet sidewalk as she ran for the door. The boy whimpered one last time before disappearing into the house, the door closing with a click that seemed final, like the period of a sentence he didn't want to finish. He stood there for a moment. The cab stopped, the meter frozen at $18.75. Raymond turned off the meter with a sudden movement, the display going dark, as if to extinguish the last chance of salvation that night. He hit the steering wheel with the back of his hand, the dry sound echoing in the empty car. "Damn," he muttered, the word coming out as a growl. He didn't know if he was angry with her, with the children, or with himself. Maybe with everyone, maybe with the whole world, which seemed to conspire to keep him trapped in that endless cycle of misery. But the relief of having done something decent, something perhaps worthwhile, was short-lived. As he turned the key in the ignition to head home, the engine coughed, hesitated, and then died. The silence returned, now accompanied by a chill that seemed to creep up the seats and up his legs. "No, no, no," Raymond shouted, turning the key again. Nothing. Just a faint click, like the last gasp of a dying animal. He pounded on the dashboard, his fists clenched, his face red with anger and despair. The cab, his livelihood, his lifeline, had given up on him right there, 3 blocks from home, in the middle of a dark street, where the only sound was the rain hitting the hood. Raymond opened the door with a kick, the icy wind hitting him like a slap in the face. The rain soaked his jacket in seconds as he climbed out, his shoes sinking into ankle-deep puddles. He went to the hood, lifting it with a grunt, but the tangle of wires and rusty parts said nothing he could understand. He wasn't a mechanic. He was just a man trying to survive. "Son of a bitch!" he shouted, his voice swallowed up by the storm. There was no one around to help, no car passing by, no miracle coming to his rescue. He got back into the driver's seat, took out his cell phone, an old model with a cracked screen, and dialed the number of a tow truck he knew. But before he could even complete the call, he saw the message on the screen. Low battery. The device went dead in his fingers, as dead as the cab, as dead as the hopes he had been carrying. Left with no choice, Raymond locked the car and began to push it to the side of the road. The weight of the vehicle struggled against him, the tires sticking to the wet asphalt, but he pushed as hard as he could, his muscles screaming, his chest heaving. The rain poured down his face, mixing with the sweat and tears he couldn't admit he was shedding. When he finally managed to get the cab out of the street, he collapsed against the door, panting, his hands shaking so much that he could barely hold on to the keys. It was almost 2 a.m. when he began the walk home, the 3 blocks seeming like 3 miles under the weight of exhaustion and defeat. The house in Hamtramck was dark, except for the dim light from the kitchen that escaped through the torn curtains. Raymond opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges like an accusation. Linda was there, sitting at the table, a cup of cold tea in front of her, her face pale under the flickering lamp. She looked up when he entered, and what he saw there knocked him more than the rain or the broken cab. Fear, pure and simple, mixed with a weariness that mirrored his own. "The bank called again," she said, her voice shaking like a rope about to snap. "They said it's the last chance, Ray. If we don't pay by Friday, they'll take the house." Raymond let the keys fall onto the table, the metallic sound cutting through the air. He sank into the chair in front of her, his hands covering his face, his fingers pressing his eyes until he saw stars. "I don't know what to do anymore, Linda," he said, his voice hoarse, broken. "I took a woman and her children home today. I didn't charge anything. And now the cab has died, and I have nothing to give you." He expected her to scream, to blame him, to throw in his face how much he had failed. But Linda only held out her hand, her cold fingers touching his, and remained silent. It was worse than any scream. That silence said that she too was giving up. He spent the night lying awake on the battered sofa in the living room, the sound of the wind outside mingling with the faint snoring of the barely working heater. Every creak in the house was a reminder of what was at stake. Every crack in the wall, every leaking pipe, every piece of roof that could collapse at any moment. He thought of the woman in the cab, her children, the blood on her forehead. He had done the right thing. That much he was sure of. But at what cost? He imagined the men from the bank knocking on the door, the furniture being taken away, Linda crying as she packed up what little was left. He imagined her eyes, those gentle eyes that had held him for so many years, finally going out for good. Raymond closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, anger came, anger at himself, at the city, at the fate that seemed to laugh in his face. He had given everything that night, and what did he get in return? A broken cab, a frightened wife, and a house that was about to be torn away from them. He punched the arm of the sofa, the fabric tearing under his fingers, but the pain didn't ease at all. He was sinking, and there was no rope to pull him back up. Not yet. Dawn crept over Detroit like a reluctant shadow, the gray sky stained red at the edges, as if the city had bled during the night. Raymond Carver didn't sleep. His eyes burned, his legs were heavy as lead, and the sofa where he had spent the last few hours seemed more like a punishment than a refuge. The house was quiet, except for the faint snoring of the heater and Linda's light footsteps in the kitchen, preparing a coffee that neither of them really wanted. He could still feel the rain on his clothes, the cold clinging to his skin, the weight of the night before crushing him like a press, the broken cab, the threat from the bank, the image of his wife and children shivering in the back seat. Everything was spinning in his mind, a merry-go-round of despair that wouldn't stop. It was 7:03 when the landline rang, the high-pitched sound cutting through the silence like a siren. Raymond raised his head, his heart racing for no apparent reason. The landline hardly ever rang. It was a relic from another era, kept more out of habit than necessity. Linda appeared in the kitchen doorway, a towel in her hands, her eyes wide with surprise. "Who's calling us at this hour?" she asked, her voice laden with a fear he knew well. He crawled over to the handset, his fingers hesitating before picking up the phone. Each ring was like a hammer hitting his head, and for a moment he thought about letting it ring, about ignoring yet another piece of bad news that was sure to come. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable even to himself. On the other end, there was a pause, and then a male voice, deep and firm, answered. "Raymond Carver. My name is Carl Grayson. You took my daughter and grandchildren home last night. I need to talk to you." The sound of those words crashed over him like thunder, and Raymond blinked, confused, his brain struggling to connect the dots. He looked at Linda, who frowned, tilting her head in silent question. Yes, I took a woman with 2 children, he replied, his throat dry. Is she all right? There was another, longer silence, and Raymond felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He imagined the worst, the woman hurt again, the children in danger, some kind of trouble he didn't see coming. But then Carl spoke, and each word was a weight that shifted the ground beneath Raymond's feet. She's alive because of you, the man said, his voice shaking slightly, as if he was holding something too big to express. Her name is Emily. Her husband dumped her yesterday, took her car, her cell phone, all the money she had. She's stuck in that alley with my grandchildren, with no way of asking for help. That place, it's a nest of drug dealers, Raymond. If you hadn't shown up, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. Raymond swallowed, Carl's words swirling around in his head like thick smoke. He remembered the alley, the graffiti on the walls, the shards of glass scattered on the floor, the shadows that seemed to move around the corners. He had heard the stories. Armed robberies, bodies found in garbage cans, women who disappeared and were never seen again. The East Side was a monster that devoured the unwary, and that woman, Emily, was right in its clutches. I only did what seemed right, he muttered, almost absently, but Carl cut him off with an intensity that made him recoil. You don't understand, Carl said, his voice rising a tone. Emily told me everything. She came home crying, almost fainting, but she repeated it over and over again, that you didn't charge her anything, that you took her home even though she didn't have a penny. She was so terrified that she could barely speak, but she kept saying how good you were to her. My daughter and grandchildren are here now, safe because of you. My family wants to thank you, Raymond, personally. I want you here tonight. Raymond stood still, the handset slipping slightly in his sweaty hand. He looked at Linda again, who was now standing next to him, her eyes wide, the towel forgotten in her hands. Where? He asked, the word coming out more like a sigh than a question. Carl gave him the address, a street in Grosse Pointe, a wealthy neighborhood about 30 minutes from Hamtramck, full of mansions and expensive cars that Raymond only saw when he drove by. Bring your wife, Carl added, 6 in the afternoon. I won't take no for an answer. Before Raymond could say anything, the call dropped, the silence returning like a wave. He slowly put the handset back on the hook, his fingers trembling. Linda stepped forward, touching his arm. Who was that? What's going on, Ray? He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come easily. It was the father of that woman in the cab, he finally said, his voice breaking. He said I saved his daughter and grandchildren. He wants us to go there today to say thank you. Linda blinked, her face changing from confusion to something Raymond hadn't seen for years, hope, however fragile, shining in her eyes. Save? She repeated, as if testing the word. He nodded, still trying to process what he had heard. The day passed in a blur. Raymond borrowed a neighbor's old Chevy, a noisy car with torn upholstery, but it worked, and by 5:30 p.m. he and Linda were on the road, his heart beating like a drum against his ribs. Grosse Pointe was another world. Wide streets, impeccable lawns, houses that looked like they were straight out of a magazine. When they pulled up in front of the number Carl had indicated, they were both stunned. It was a mansion. White columns at the entrance, tall windows shining with golden lights, an iron gate that screamed money. Raymond squeezed Linda's hand, feeling the sweat on her palms, and rang the doorbell with a hesitant finger. Carl Grayson opened the door almost immediately, a tall man of about 60, with slicked-back grey hair and a grey suit that looked like it cost more than Raymond's entire cab. His eyes, blue and penetrating, met Raymond's with an intensity that made him want to flinch. "You came," Carl said, a small but genuine smile appearing on his face. "Come in." He led them inside, the marble floor echoing under Raymond's worn shoes, the air smelling of polished wood, and something sweet he couldn't identify. In the living room, Emily was there. Raymond recognized her immediately, but she looked different, her hair clean and loose, her face washed, the cut on her forehead covered by a discreet bandage. She was holding a cup of tea, her fingers still trembling, and next to her on the carpet, the children were playing with a golden retriever, the boy laughing while the girl stroked the dog's fur. When Emily saw Raymond, she left her cup on the table with a sudden movement and stood up, her eyes watering. "You," she said, her voice breaking, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved me yesterday. My children, I thought I was going to lose them." Raymond was speechless, the weight of those words hitting him like a punch. Linda squeezed his hand tighter, her eyes also shining with tears. I just took you home," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. Emily shook her head, taking a step forward. "No, you don't understand. My husband, he hit me, left me there with nothing. I was trying to find a phone, but no one would stop, no one would help. That alley, I heard footsteps behind me, voices. If you hadn't shown up, She stopped, choking on a sob, and Carl put his hand on her shoulder, his face hardening. "Her ex-husband was a worm," Carl said, his voice low but charged with anger. "I warned Emily about him, but she didn't listen. He ran off with everything yesterday, the car, the money, even her cell phone. He left her and the children to die in that place. I didn't know where she was until she came home, almost fainting on the doorstep." He looked at Raymond, his eyes shining with something that looked like gratitude mixed with determination. "You changed everything, Raymond, and I won't forget it." The dinner that followed was surreal. A long table covered with a white tablecloth, porcelain plates filled with food Raymond didn't even know the name of, roast beef in a thick sauce, boiled vegetables that sparkled like jewels, red wine in glasses he held for fear of breaking. Carl spoke proudly of his daughter, telling her how she was back home now, how he was going to take care of her and the grandchildren. He owned a chain of car dealerships all over Michigan, an empire that started with a small garage in the 1980s and grew into a fortune. Raymond listened, uncomfortable, his sweaty hands gripping his fork. He didn't belong there, in that house, at that table. He just wanted to leave, to go back to Hamtramck, to the simple life that was falling apart. But then Carl changed his tune. After dinner, while the children played with Linda in the back garden, he pulled Raymond into a corner of the room, his eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the air seem heavier. "I have something to tell you," Carl began, his voice low but firm. "What you did yesterday, it wasn't just a favor, it was a miracle. And I want to give you something in return." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, handing it to Raymond with an almost ceremonial gesture. Raymond opened the envelope slowly, the paper trembling in his hands. Inside was a check, $50,000, written in elegant handwriting, signed with Carl Grayson's name. He blinked, the number spinning before his eyes like a mirage. "What?" he began, but Carl held up his hand, interrupting him. "That pays your mortgage," he said, his voice calm but loaded with authority. "I know you're in trouble, Raymond. Emily told me you didn't charge anything, and I made some calls earlier today. I know about your house, your bank. This money solves that, and there's a bit left for you to breathe, but that's not all." Raymond was paralyzed, the check hot in his hands as if it would burn. He looked at Carl, his heart beating so loudly that it seemed to echo in the room. "There's more," Carl continued, his eyes shining. "I want you to work for me. I have a managerial position at one of my dealerships in Dearborn. Fixed salary, benefits, stability. You're a good man, Raymond. You deserve a chance to get out of this hole." The ground seemed to shake beneath Raymond's feet. He looked at the check, then at Carl, then at Linda, who was returning from the garden with a shy smile on her face. It was everything he had ever wanted: security, a future, a way out. But it was also too much, too fast, too big. He felt like he was being sucked into a whirlpool, and he didn't know whether to fight or let go. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Carl smiled, a smile that mixed gratitude and something deeper. "I know," he said. "That's why you deserve it." The living room of the Grayson mansion seemed to pulsate with an energy that Raymond Carver couldn't explain. The soft lights of the crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows on the walls, covered in expensive paintings, and the smell of polished wood, mixed with the red wine he had barely touched during dinner, filled the air. Carl Grayson stood before him, his blue eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and determination, the $50,000 check still warm in Raymond's trembling hands. In the background, Linda was laughing softly with the children in the garden, the muffled sounds of happiness coming through the glass doors like a melody from a world he never thought he could reach. But there, at that moment, with the heavy envelope in his hands and the job offer hanging in the air, Raymond felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, not with emotion, but with a fear he didn't want to name. "I don't know what to say," he muttered, his hoarse voice scratching his dry throat. The check felt alive, pulsing against his fingers as if it had a heart of its own, and the printed numbers 50,000 spun before his eyes like a promise he didn't deserve. He looked at Carl, the man who had just turned his life upside down with a few words and a piece of paper. That's too much," he managed to say, the words coming out in chunks as if they were stones he needed to spit out. "I only took your daughter home. I didn't do anything to earn it." Carl crossed his arms, the impeccable grey suit moving with him like a second skin. "You're wrong, Raymond," he said, his voice firm, but charged with something that sounded like restrained emotion. "You don't understand what you've done. My daughter was in that alley alone, with 2 small children with no one to help. You stopped. You got her out. You gave her a chance to survive a night that could have been the end. That's not nothing. That's everything." He took a step forward, his face hardening with an intensity that made Raymond recoil instinctively. "I lost my wife to a car accident 10 years ago. Emily is all I have left, apart from those 2 little ones out there. If I lost them too—" He paused, swallowing dryly, his eyes shining for a moment before he pulled himself together. "You gave me my family back, Raymond. That check and that job. It's not charity. It's justice." Raymond felt his chest tighten, as if an invisible hand was crushing his lungs. He looked at the check again, the zeros dancing before him like ghosts of a future he had never dared to imagine. $50,000. It was enough to pay off the overdue mortgage, to ward off the bank vultures that prowled around his house in Hamtramck like hungry predators. It was enough to fix the leaky roof, to buy decent food for the first time in months, to give Linda a day without the weight of fear on her shoulders. And the job, manager at a car dealership in Dearborn, with a fixed salary and benefits, was more than he had dreamed of in years. It was a rope thrown to a drowning man, a way out of a life that was slowly killing him. But then doubt came, sharp as a blade, slicing through the hope that was beginning to grow. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't stopped in that alley for money, for a job, for a mansion full of promises. He had stopped because he saw a woman crying, because he heard a child's cry, because something inside him, a part he thought had died a long time ago, refused to turn away. Accepting it all now felt dirty, as if he were selling a piece of his soul for something he had done without expecting anything in return. He imagined his neighbors in Hamtramck, the guys at the bar on the corner, the other cabbies who struggled as much as he did. What would they say? That he'd turned into an upscale beggar, taking handouts from a rich guy for a free ride? "I didn't do it for a reward," he said, the words coming out harsher than he had intended, the check trembling in his hands as if he were about to tear it up. Carl tilted his head, his eyes narrowing for a moment before a small, almost sad smile appeared on his face. "I know," he replied, his voice softening. "That's why you deserve it. Men like you, men who do the right thing without thinking about what they're going to get, are rare, Raymond. I've lived long enough to know that, and I have the power to pull you out of this hole that life has thrown you into. Let me do it." Raymond was silent, the weight of the decision crashing down on him like thunder. He looked at Linda through the glass doors. She was kneeling on the lawn, helping the little girl hold a flower, her face lit up with a smile he hadn't seen for years. He thought of the sleepless nights, the bills piled up on the kitchen table, the broken-down cab that still lay in the street like an abandoned carcass. He thought of Linda's voice last night, trembling as she talked about the bank, the way she held his hand as if it were the last thing keeping her whole. He thought about how she deserved more than a bankrupt husband, more than a house falling apart, more than a life of constant fear. But accepting that money, that job, was like crossing a line he never wanted to cross. He had pride, a stubborn, perhaps stupid pride, but it had kept him on his feet when everything was falling apart. He had fought alone for so long, carried the weight without asking for help, that the idea of being saved by another man, a stranger to boot, made him feel like he was drowning in shame. He looked at Carl, the man who looked like a king in that marble and glass castle, and felt a pang of anger mixed with gratitude. Why now? Why could this guy, with all the money and power in the world, change his life with the snap of a finger, while he, Raymond, had crawled through the mud for years with no one to reach out to? "I don't know if I can accept it," he finally said, his voice low but firm, the check still in his hands like a grenade about to explode. Carl frowned, surprised, but not angry. "Why?" he asked, his tone more curious than challenging. Raymond took a deep breath, the air coming out in a shaky sigh. "Because I'm not that kind of guy. I don't take what I haven't earned. I work, I struggle, I pay my bills, or at least I try to. If I accept that, I become someone else, someone I don't know if I can look at in the mirror." Carl was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on Raymond, as if trying to read something written in the tired lines of his face. Then he stepped forward, his hand resting on Raymond's shoulder with a strength that was both firm and gentle. "You're wrong again," Carl said, his voice almost a whisper. "Accepting it doesn't change you, it saves you. It's not about pride, Raymond, it's about what you deserve. And I'm not just giving it to you for me or for Emily, I'm giving it to you for her." He pointed to Linda in the garden, who was now holding the boy in her arms, laughing as the dog jumped around them. "She deserves it, doesn't she? After everything you've been through?" Raymond felt a lump in his throat, Carl's words hitting him like a punch in the chest. He looked at Linda again, her smile cutting through the fog of doubt that smothered him. He saw the years of struggle on her shoulders, the nights she lay awake beside him, the times she wiped away his tears with her calloused hands. He saw the love that never wavered, even when he failed, even when he came home empty-handed. Carl was right. She deserved it. More than him, more than anyone, Linda deserved a chance to breathe, to live without the constant weight of defeat. But the dilemma still burned inside him. He squeezed the check tighter, the paper crinkling slightly at the edges, and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to hear something inside him, a voice telling him what to do. He imagined refusing, throwing the check in Carl's face, walking out of that mansion with his head held high and his pride intact. He imagined going back to Hamtramck, fixing the cab with what little he could scrape together, fighting another day, another week, another month. But then he saw Linda's face in those visions, the fear returning, the smile disappearing, her eyes fading again as the bank knocked on the door. "I don't know," he said, opening his eyes, his voice almost a moan. Carl didn't move, but his eyes softened, as if he understood what was going on inside Raymond. "You know?" he said simply. "You just have to say yes." Raymond looked at the check one last time, the numbers now etched into his mind like a tattoo. He thought of the woman in the alley, her children, the blood on her forehead. He thought about how he had stopped the cab without hesitation, how he had said, "Get in," without thinking about the money, without thinking about himself. Maybe Carl was right. Maybe this was justice, not charity. Maybe it was the universe, or God, or whatever it was, finally throwing him a rope after years of letting him drown. "Okay," he finally said, the word coming out as a sigh, a weight falling from his shoulders as he spoke. "I accept." Carl smiled, a broad, genuine smile that lit up his face as if a cloud had cleared. "You won't regret it," he said, squeezing Raymond's shoulder harder before releasing him. "Come with me tomorrow to the dealership. We'll sign the papers, get everything settled. Tonight, just enjoy the rest of the evening." Raymond nodded, the check still in his hands, the weight of it now different, no longer a grenade, but a key. He looked at Linda again, his heart racing but lighter, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he'd forgotten: hope. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. He had made the decision, crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. The climax of the evening had passed, but the real impact was yet to come, and he knew it, even if he couldn't imagine what awaited him. The night at the Grayson mansion ended in a soft, almost reverent silence, as if the very air knew that something monumental had happened. Raymond Carver and Linda left Grosse Pointe with the $50,000 check tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket, the paper folded carefully as if it were a talisman against the years of misery they had experienced. The borrowed Chevy purred down the dark highway, the lights of Detroit twinkling in the distance like fallen stars, and Linda held his hand in the passenger seat, her fingers warm against his cold skin. Neither of them spoke much. There weren't enough words to describe what they were feeling, that mixture of relief, fear, and a hope so fragile that it felt like it could shatter at the slightest touch. Over the next few days, everything changed with a speed that made Raymond dizzy. He took the check to the bank the next morning, his heart pounding as the clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses hanging from her nose, confirmed the amount with a look of surprise that she tried to disguise. "That clears your mortgage, Mr. Carver," she said, typing numbers into the computer with cold efficiency, "and there's a little left over. Would you like to deposit it in your account?" Raymond nodded, his voice caught in his throat, and as he left the bank with the receipt in his hand, he felt the March sun hit his face as if for the first time in years. The house in Hamtramck, with its crooked roof, its cracked walls, its ghosts of defeats past, was theirs again. They weren't going to lose it. They weren't going to be thrown out on the street. The broken-down cab was sold to a junkyard for $200, a bitter but necessary farewell. Raymond stood on the sidewalk as the winch took the Ford Crown Victoria away, the rusty metal creaking as if protesting the end. He felt an emptiness in his chest as he watched it disappear around the corner, as if a part of his life was being dragged along with it. But then he thought of the job Carl Grayson had promised him at the car dealership in Dearborn, and the emptiness gave way to something new, a determination he hadn't felt since the factory days, when he still believed that hard work could build a future. A week later, he was there. The Grayson Motors dealership was a modern building on Michigan Avenue with shiny glass walls and rows of new cars glistening under the sun. Black SUVs, silver sedans, red pickups that seemed to scream power. Raymond walked in, wearing a blue dress shirt that Linda had carefully ironed the night before, the stiff collar rubbing against his neck in a way that made him feel like an imposter. Carl welcomed him to his office on the second floor, a large room overlooking the showroom, a mahogany desk covered in papers, and a wall full of award plaques. "Welcome to the team," Carl said, shaking his hand with a force that seemed to seal a pact. You start as a sales manager. Salary of 60,000 a year, health insurance for your bad back, and a bonus if the store hits its targets. What do you think? Raymond blinked, the number spinning in his head like a beacon on a dark night. 60,000 a year. He and Linda together had barely made 30,000 in the last year, counting her shifts at the market and the sporadic cab rides. It was more than money. It was a new life, a chance to breathe, to lift his head without the constant weight of survival. He signed the contract with a pen Carl handed him, his hand trembling slightly as he traced his name on the paper. When he'd finished, Carl smiled, a broad, almost fatherly smile, and patted him on the shoulder. "You'll do well here, Raymond. I know it." The first few weeks were a blur of learning. Raymond swapped the steering wheel of his cab for a clipboard and a badge with his name printed on it in black letters. He walked around the showroom, talking to customers who smelled of expensive perfume and drove cars he could never afford before, explaining finance rates and engine options with a confidence he pretended until he began to feel it for real. His colleagues, young salesmen in suits and women in high heels, looked at him curiously at first, but soon accepted him, impressed by his calm under pressure and the way he closed sales without seeming desperate. For the first time in years, Raymond came home with a check in his pocket, not empty promises, and Linda welcomed him with a hot dinner on the table, ground beef with mashed potatoes, nothing fancy, but enough to warm his heart. But the real shock came a month later, on an April afternoon so ordinary that it almost seemed an insult to what was to come. Raymond was in the dealership office, going over sales reports with a pen bitten between his teeth, when Carl appeared in the doorway. The man was out of his usual suit, wearing a blue polo shirt and khaki pants, his face serious in a way that made Raymond drop the pen immediately. "I need to tell you something," Carl said, closing the door behind him and sitting down in the chair in front of the desk. His tone was low, almost conspiratorial, and Raymond felt a shiver run up his spine, as if the ground might open up at any moment. "Have you ever wondered how I found you so quickly?" Carl began, his eyes fixed on Raymond's with an intensity that pinned him to the chair. "How did I know your name, your phone number, everything about you before Emily even told me what happened?" Raymond frowned, his heart racing as he tried to understand. He had never stopped to think about it. In the adrenaline of the moment, in the rush of the following days, it all seemed to make sense. But now, with Carl looking at him like that, a cold doubt began to grow in his chest. I don't know," he said, his voice wavering. "You said she told you." Carl nodded, but the movement was slow, almost calculated. "She did. Yes, but I knew before. That alley where you found Emily. It was no accident, Raymond. I have security cameras there. One of my warehouses is 2 blocks away, a parts warehouse that I keep off the books to avoid high taxes. I installed hidden cameras months ago after a couple of robberies. I saw you stop the cab that night. I saw you opening the door, shouting at her to get in. I saw you take her away." Raymond felt the air escape from his lungs, the shock hitting him like an icy wave. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The words were stuck, tangled in a knot of confusion and something that felt like betrayal. Did you spy on me?" he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, his hands clenching the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Carl shook his head, raising his hands as if to calm him down. "It wasn't like that. I wasn't spying on you. I was monitoring the warehouse. But that night I got an alert on my cell phone, movement in the alley. I opened the app and saw Emily there with the children crying, lost. I recognized her instantly, even in the grainy image. My heart stopped, Raymond. I was 40 minutes away at home, and I knew I wouldn't make it in time." He paused, his eyes shining with an emotion Raymond hadn't expected. Guilt, perhaps, or something deeper. "Then I saw you," Carl continued. "An old cab pulling up out of nowhere, a guy shouting at her to get in. I saw you saving my daughter before I even knew who you were. I called my security to check the scene, but you'd already left with them. When Emily came home and told me the rest, I put the pieces together. I used my contacts to find you. Your name was on the cab registration, and the rest was easy. But I needed to meet you. I needed to make sure you were real." Raymond blinked, the world spinning around him as he tried to process what he was hearing. Cameras. Carl had seen everything. The moment he stopped, the scream he gave, the decision he made without knowing he was being watched. He felt a heat rise to his face, a mixture of anger and shame that made him want to get up and leave. "Did you test me?" he asked, his voice shaking with indignation. Carl shook his head again, more emphatically this time. "No, it was never a test. It was a miracle, Raymond. I didn't plan it. How could I? But when I saw who you were, what you did without knowing I was watching, I knew I had to bring you here. Not just to thank you, but to give you what you deserve." Silence fell between them, heavy and dense as Raymond tried to breathe. He thought back to that night, the scream in the alley, the rain on his face, the weight of that moment that he thought was his alone. Knowing that Carl was there, watching from afar like an invisible judge, changed everything and at the same time changed nothing. He had still stopped the cab. He had still said, "Get in." He'd still taken Emily and the children home without charging a penny. But now there was a new layer, a hidden truth that made his gesture seem bigger, more dangerous, more real. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Carl sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because I didn't want you to think it was about that. The cameras, the money, the job. It was about you, about the kind of man you are. But now that you're here, working with me, I thought you deserved to know the whole truth. You were the angel I couldn't be, Raymond. And I'll never forget that." Raymond remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, the sales reports forgotten. He felt the weight of the revelation settle on his shoulders, but this time it wasn't a burden. It was something different, something he couldn't name. He thought about how it had all started, a shout in the rain, a run without payment, a phone call he almost didn't answer. He thought about how his life had been turned upside down by a camera he'd never seen, by a man he'd never met until that day. That night he stood on the porch of the house in Hamtramck, the cool April air wiping away the smell of oil and concrete that Detroit carried like a brand. The street was silent except for the distant barking of a dog and the rustle of budding trees. Linda slept inside, her face peaceful for the first time in years, and Raymond held a can of cheap beer, the metal cold against his fingers. He looked up at the sky, the stars shining above the city like points of light in a sea of darkness, and let his thoughts flow. He had never believed in fate. Life for him was a series of punches you learned to take, a game with no rules where the weak lost and the strong survived. But now, with the check paying off the mortgage, the new job, Carl's truth echoing in his head, he wondered, what if it was more than that? What if kindness was a currency that life returned with interest, a risk worth taking even if you didn't know the outcome? He had suffered, God, how he had suffered, with the years in the factory, the loss of the babies, the cab that sucked him dry day after day. He'd fought, almost given up, fallen so many times he'd lost count. But in that alley, unaware that anyone was watching, he had planted a seed that changed everything. Raymond took a sip of his beer, the familiar bitter taste on his tongue, and closed his eyes for a moment. He saw Emily in the back seat, her children shaking, the blood on her forehead. He saw Linda in the kitchen, her hands in his, her smile in the garden of the mansion. He saw Carl, his eyes shining with gratitude and secrets. And then he saw himself, not the bankrupt taxi driver, not the defeated man, but someone who could still make a difference, someone who still had something to offer. Sometimes the biggest risk isn't losing everything. He muttered to himself, his voice lost in the light night wind. It's giving nothing. He opened his eyes, the sky above him clear and infinite, and for the first time in a long time, Raymond Carver felt he could breathe. Life hadn't ended with him. It had begun again. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is crafted with dedication and care, with a view to touching the hearts of those who hear it. If this narrative has awakened something in you, please consider signing up so that we can continue together on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is essential if we are to continue sharing these unique experiences. Cheers, and we'll see you in the next story.